session, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a session with two of our very long-term researchers in risk research. Paul Slavik, director at the Oregon Institute for Risk Decision Making, has been working in this area since the 60s. 59. The first prominent articles, I think, 62, building up the risk, the paradigm for risk research that has been used very much in the whole area, in the whole world. Lennart is also a person who has worked in this area since the 60s and 70s, risk research very much in the 70s, and also we think that we will have a very interesting debate going back into history, trying to look into the future after two presentations. We have a limited time, of course, and unfortunately, 25 minutes per person, and then we go into the discussion part. So if everybody is comfortable, Paul, please go on.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excuse me, we should put the headsets on you as well. And there is somebody here doing these things, yes. And that is for the interpreters who are in a different room. So everybody who is later on having something to say in the discussion should also wait for a microphone, because the interpreters are in a different room, even if we can hear each other well. Yes.
Okay. Good. Can you hear me? So I know this is a session on methodology, but I'm going to talk about studies and results, and hopefully the methods will be visible as I discuss the results. I've been interested in the issue of public acceptance of nuclear energy and the opposition that has been quite prevalent in many, in the United States and many other countries. And this quote by Alvin Weinberg, 1976, I think foretold the challenge. And he said that the issue of public perception and acceptance of nuclear energy was not anticipated by the founders of this technology, and it has emerged as the most critical question concerning the future of nuclear energy. This was 35 years ago, and I think it's still very true today. One of an interesting image when it was first suggested that one might look at the state of Maine as a place for one of just to examine it as a possible high-level site for the radioactive waste. They had this type of opposition. It took place everywhere in the United States that was even suggested, and ultimately led to selecting Yucca Mountain as a possible site because there were so few people there to protest. Now, fast forwarding to a couple of weeks ago, a letter in our local newspaper, I think, illustrates the attitudes of many people today. Still, you can see the headline, nuclear power is absurd. This is after Fukushima, which has sort of revived these latent concerns that people had. And I don't have time to read the whole quote, but it's not very favorable towards nuclear energy. This is an extensive slide. Also is the summary of a report that was done for the during the development of the Yucca Mountain project. The state of Nevada hired consultants to evaluate the possible social and economic effects of a repository in Yucca Mountain, and this committee, led by Kai Erickson, William Glaser, and Gilbert White, summarized it and talked about the issue of dread. The ability to evoke dread in human beings must be counted as one of the key properties of radioactive waste, and not to know this essential fact about nuclear waste is like not knowing their half-lives, their thermal qualities, or any other their physical and chemical characteristics. Nuclear power nuclear waste evokes feelings of dread in people, at least in the United States and other places. Kai Erickson, one of the authors of that quote, did further research trying to understand why it is that people have a special fear of exposure through accidents to radiation and chemicals. He interviewed people, and he draws attention to this theme of toxicity, both radioactive and chemical, that characterizes what he called a whole new species of trouble associated with modern technological disasters. And he did these interviews, and he concluded that unlike natural disasters, radiation and chemical accidents are unbounded. Unlike conventional disaster plots, they have no end. Invisible contaminants remain a part of the surrounding, absorbed into the grain of the landscape, the tissues of the body, and worst of all, into the genetic material of the survivors. And all clear is never sounded, the book of accounts is never closed. And that was his attempt to understand why we react much more strongly to exposure to chemicals and radiation, even in small amounts, than to the risk of natural disasters, as we have seen over and over again, are tremendously damaging. But we are more complacent and accepting of what nature does to us. A long time ago, we started to do what we call psychometric studies of risk perception. We had different types of hazards, and we asked people to evaluate them give them a number on a scale from 0 to 100. We averaged these numbers. We rank ordered the numbers. This is a very early study, and we see that that in this study for the public, nuclear power had the highest perceived risk, but for a group of risk assessment experts, it was a 20th on a list of 30. And it's interesting to think, well, maybe it was radiation that is the key factor here for the public, but here's medical x-rays, radiation technology, which was low in the concern of the public and much higher in the view of the experts. So it's more than just radiation. So in an attempt to understand what it was, we also looked at other qualities of hazards, whether one was exposed voluntarily or not, whether it evoked dread, whether it could be fatal as opposed to injurious, and so forth, all of these factors. And we found that hazardous activities, like people, have kind of a personality profile. This is we can see that nuclear power and X-rays not only differed in perception of risk, but they also differed on these qualities. Nuclear power judged as less voluntary, more catastrophic, more dreaded, more likely to be fatal, less controllable, newer, and so forth. And so this in part may account for the differences. They're seen as qualitatively different on important aspects of risk. These qualities aren't independent. Through statistical analysis, we found that, for example, if something is catastrophic, it's likely to be dreaded and fatal. We did certain analyses which collapsed these two dimensions into a two-dimensional space, which is unreadable, but it's basically all of these qualities we called part of a dread factor, and not dreaded over here. And then these qualities, not observable, unknown, new risk, led to something we call unknown versus known. And then the world of hazards and perception was arrayed according to how they were rated on these qualities. And so nuclear issues are up here in the dread and unknown part of the space. We found that perception of risk was low here, it increases as you go here. Also, the acceptability of the risk was greater here than here. Very early work. And there were some generalities that came out. Acceptance is reduced if the hazard is new or unfamiliar, or if exposure is involuntarily, if it's not under one's control, if it evokes feelings of dread, and so forth. All of this is from way back. Around 1990, another interest emerged for some of the researchers, something called affect. Affect is just a technical jargon psychology for feeling. Feeling of something being good or bad, positive or negative. And this led to a research program that we're still pursuing called The Feeling of Risk. And there's a recent book that summarizes the last 10 years of research on this, and I'll describe a little bit of that. It really is interested in the interaction between a kind of a deliberative or analytic approach to risk, which calculates probabilities and is very logical, and kind of a gut feeling sort of sense of risk. And what we find is that risk resides in us mostly as a gut feeling, and relying on feelings is very natural and rational, but sometimes it gets us into trouble. There are a lot of theories in psychology that start with the notion that we think in images, which carry feelings, which then motivate our behavior. And of course, I don't have time to go into all of these theories, but they come from linguistics, learning theory, neurology, social psychology, and particularly this is interesting basic concept. Thought is made largely from images, both perceptual and symbolic, and these become marked by positive and negative feeling states or affect, and then that leads to either alarm or aversive behavior or approach behavior. So it's about images and feelings, and here's a powerful image of the last century linked to not only the nuclear bomb, but we find that that also has colored our view of nuclear power. As this quote from Kirk Smith indicates, nuclear energy was conceived in secrecy, born in war, and first revealed to the world in horror. No matter how much proponents try to separate the peaceful from the weapons atom, the connection is firmly embedded in the minds of the public. And interestingly, in the 1990s, some 50 years after the atomic bomb was launched, we asked people, what's the first thought that comes to mind when you hear the word nuclear power? We did this in France and the US, and we got a high percentage of people responding to nuclear power with bomb and weapons and war thoughts in both countries. So half a century later, when you say nuclear power, people have this, something in their brain also is linked to the bomb. I think it's another aspect of the dread part of it. Spencer Wirt, a historian of physics, also talked about the importance of images. Even before the bomb, there was radioactivity was associated with very spooky images, and he says it's still alive today. The images are more powerful today than ever. So images. Affect and emotions are essential to rational thinking and decision making. And this quote by Damasio says that really rational behavior needs both logical analysis, but it also needs, you need to be sensitive to feelings as well. He wrote a whole book about this. So my interest came from the link to risk perception and the dread finding, and also nuclear waste imagery. In this space that I showed you before, this dimension proved to be the most predictive of people's attitudes towards hazards. We also noticed in these first studies that perceived risk and perceived benefit were inversely related, and we ignored this finding for more than a decade. I'll come back to this in a minute and show and link it up to affect. I was with a group that was advising the state of Nevada on the what might happen economically to the state if the repository was sited at Yucca Mountain. Would it affect tourism, business development, and so forth? We tried to figure out how to study that. We didn't want to just ask people directly, if they built a repository, would you stop going to Nevada for recreation, for retirement? We thought we couldn't trust that. So we borrowed a trick from advertising, again linking to this image notion. We studied images, associations, and feelings with the notion that if people began to associate Southern Nevada with nuclear waste, they might be less attracted to going there for retirement, for business development, or entertainment. So we asked people to free associate to Nevada or to states. When you think of San Diego, for example, what's the first thought or image that comes to mind? When you think of Nevada, what comes to mind? We found that when we elicited images, this is from one person. When we to San Diego, this is what that person said. To Las Vegas, this is what they said. Then we went back and said, okay, you said busy freeway. Is that good or bad? Rated on a scale of positive to negative. And then we summed these ratings, and here you see this person who had a much more favorable image of San Diego than Las Vegas. We found that that one could predict their selection of a place to go to vacation or retire based on the valence, the positivity of their images. So that established that these associations were related to behavior that was economically relevant. Then we asked people to free associate to nuclear waste. What's the first phrase that comes to mind when you hear the terms nuclear waste? And there was nothing negative. It's rather quite nasty what people said, about 98% negative when just triggered by the words nuclear waste. And we concluded in an article that this mechanism is a mechanism whereby there could possibly be adverse stigmatization and economic effects if the repository was sited in southern Nevada and events took place like accidents or other things that brought it to mind, publicized that Nevada was a waste site. And then the Department of Energy cut off our funding for any further research in this direction, so we didn't go on to quantify it. So coming back to the risks and benefits being negatively related, we have concluded that risks and benefits are fused in the mind into an overall feeling of risk. And what do I mean by this? So in the world, risk and benefit are positively related. If these are different activities, like driving a car, flying a plane, we see that if benefit is high, it might be low in risk or high in risk. If benefit is low, it tends to be, these activities would tend to be low in risk. If they're up here, we try to get rid of things up here. If they have no benefit but high risk, we do our best to eradicate them. So there's a positive relationship. But if you ask people, what's the risk of this and the benefit of this? When you do this judgmentally, you get just the opposite picture. You get a strong negative, just the opposite of the way the world is structured. Here's an example of actual data on risk and benefit of different activities and technologies. See that strong inverse relationship. You can also see it, well, it took 15 years, and a student of mine finally did a dissertation on this, and he found that that this inverse relationship was linked to whether or not the activity was judged to be good or bad. So here's actual real data from survey data. We have two radiation technologies. We have the bad radiation, nuclear power, low in benefit, high in risk. These are actual survey, national survey results. We have the good radiation, medical x-rays, high in benefit, low in risk. Same thing with chemicals. The bad chemicals, low in benefit, high in risk. The good chemicals, medicines, high benefit, low in risk. This is just an example of this inverse relationship. And what we concluded was, and further studied, was that when people judge risk and benefit, they first ask themselves, they first consult their feelings. How do I feel about this nuclear waste repository? Is it something good or bad? And then if it's good, then they judge the benefit to be high and the risk is low. If they have a bad feeling about it, it's just the opposite. They judge the benefit is low and the risk is high. So the benefit, the feelings drive these responses. And so then we conducted experiments. We said, okay, maybe we can change the feeling by giving information, say that the benefit is high. And then we can ask about the risk. Without giving any information about the risk, we would assume that if we make it more positive, the risk judgment would be lower. And we did this in a wide range of directions with nuclear power and with other activities. And we found that that was indeed what happened, that you could influence one judgment by information about the other just through changing the feelings to test this affect heuristic notion. So there's other ways now that we have of looking at feelings and impacts just in terms of methodology. One can look at the ripple effects of an adverse event using something called systems dynamic modeling. Since this is a session on methodology, I'll just allude briefly. This is an example of an attempt to model the way that fear would change over time after a terrorist event. And you see how complex it is with models and submodels, nonlinear relationships, feedback loops. But it's a way of trying to predict what would happen over time to the level of fear in a population after people were killed either in a propane tank explosion or a a terrorist bomb or anthrax kind of thing. And again, this is like the output of one of those systems dynamic models, sort of a new direction, and still in the process of being worked through this methodology. Another approach is trying to go beyond superficial understanding towards deeper knowledge of the risk. So in the early work that I showed you, we just ask, what's your sense of risk? How high is your risk from technology like nuclear power? But through work on cigarette smoking, we came to see that you really had to look at different layers of knowledge. That, for example, if you ask people, what's the risk of, how high is the risk of smoking? Everyone knows that it's dangerous to your health, but it's a superficial level of knowledge. People say, yes, smoking is bad. But then you start to push, well, how is it bad? What are the diseases? What do you know about what diseases are caused by smoking? And then and so people say lung cancer, but then they can't name any others. They say smoking is hard to quit, but they don't know much about addiction. So then you push further, and there's certain levels of deeper knowledge that are essential for decision making. And most young people who are starting to smoke don't have this level of knowledge. So the point here is that our old way of asking at the surface, what's the risk of something, just is getting at the superficial. You really need to probe more deeply to understand what they know about the pathways to risk, the type of consequences, the seriousness of the consequences. So this is kind of a model that could be applied to nuclear and other types of hazards that has yet not been widely used beyond smoking. Another challenge based on risk perception research is that people's ideologies and worldviews strongly influence their acceptance and perception of risk. So there's a scholar at Yale, Dan Kahan, who's doing work called cultural cognition. How's my time? 5 minutes? Based on the earlier work of Douglas and Wildowski, who identified different types of views of people. Hierarchist is a person who likes the structure of society with top to bottom. And egalitarian is just the opposite. They want more widely distributed power and wealth in the society and so forth. And one finds that these attitudes are predictive of attitudes towards risk. We found this a long time ago. Here's a response to a question, whether you agree or disagree that if your community needed more electricity, you should build a new nuclear power plant. And this is the egalitarian worldview that people expressed. And if it was high egalitarians, there were much less acceptance of nuclear power than if they were low on this worldview. Even though the worldview doesn't seem to have anything to do with nuclear energy, it's about distribution of influence in society. And more recently, Kahan has been looking at nanotechnology. He's been giving people risk and benefit information about nanotechnology, and looking at their worldviews. And before they have the information, there's not much difference. When they get this information, the egalitarians and communitarians focus on the risk information and become less favorable. The individualists and hierarchists go the opposite way and become more favorable. So you see the same information drives people apart, contingent on protecting their worldviews. This just describes this in more detail. So is there hope for nuclear power? The affect heuristic implies that strong appreciation of need or benefit may diminish the perception of the importance of perceived risk. We had an early study, US versus France, national surveys on risk perception. We thought that they would differ in perception of nuclear power, but this is a difference between the responses in the two countries in terms of perception of risk. It was the smallest for nuclear than for anything else. We did find differences, though. We find much greater perception of need or benefit in France than in the US, and also some differences with regard to trust, much greater trust in experts in France. So apparently that was more important than perception of risk, but particularly the benefit perception, the perceived need is greater. We also have found that the WIP facility in New Mexico, after 25 years, it was successfully opened. And there's a recent article in the risk analysis that describes public polling on and change over 25 years and gradual acceptance of this. And I'm going to put some references here for anyone's interested. They can you can see some of these articles, recent articles about worldviews, article in Nature about the difficulty of bringing people together of different worldviews, and several others, why facts don't matter, fixing the communications failure, the science of why we don't believe in science. All of this highlights the difficulty of overcoming worldviews, the polarization that exists. But I put this here only to leave it as a reference, so if you're interested, you can see the references from the slides. Some things I haven't really talked about, but we might want to talk about in the discussion. We came out of the risk perception work. Gender differences. White males had lower perceived risk for environmental hazards than women did. The importance of trust, a lot discussed this morning. That's been studied. Risk and stigma, the fact that places associated with nuclear problems become stigmatized. Certainly that will be relevant now in Japan. And the importance of the decision process in leading to acceptance. So I apologize for the fast pace of this, but maybe we can discuss some of this later. Thank you.
It was an excellent review in exactly 25 minutes. Thank you so much. It's an achievement in itself.